Well, so then let me turn to the main event. I've got a snoot full of tequila and a messianic mission. I'm pawing the ground to talk to you, as usual.
New Year's.
Everybody has their own New Year's.
That's right.
I guess the title of tonight's talk is Linear Societies and Nonlinear Drugs, which is something that I just had to pull out of the air when Ken finally slammed me to the wall for what I would be talking about this night many months ago. But more and more for me, especially with this group, these things have become sort of summations and, I guess I hope, convivial examinations of just where we are, we, each and every one of us, and then this enterprise, whatever we mean by that, in the context of everything else that's happening in the world. In other words, the psychedelic experience, the entheogenic experience, contextualized. And as I try to think about, what, if anything, I can bring to the party, I guess it's that what I'm interested in is psychedelics as a philosophical tool. And when I concretized that for myself, I realized there's no claims on that part of discourse. No one wants to do this. Academic philosophy is done in a very formal manner, and the most exciting is incredibly stuffy. And yet, I, like most of you, I assume, have taken on board in my life this thing called the psychedelic experience, which is then as large a portion of my being as my sexuality, my politics, my education. It shapes everything. And yet nowhere in the world of philosophical discourse is there any genuflection, at least overtly, made to this. I mean, maybe not since Plato. We talked about shadows on the wall of a cave and so forth and so on. Well, so what can psychedelics and the psychedelic experience bring to philosophy? And what do I mean by philosophy? By philosophy, I mean the enterprise of discursive thinking, trying to understand what the world is and who's asking the question. Where did the world come from? Where is it bound? And who's along for the ride? It seems to me that we, as a community, have, this is sort of hard to wrap your mind around, at least for me, but we have, in a sense, inculcated into ourselves the image of an underclass, so that we struggle for legal toleration of our practices and our habits, but we don't struggle for intellectual legitimation of our visions. We accept that they are somehow contextually marginal. And as I thought about that, I realized that is a limitation on the community. That the information which is coming from the psychedelic experience as interpreted by Western people is primary evidence for the need for a major paradigm shift in the whole way the Western mentality does business. Well, what kind of evidence and what kind of shift? Well, there's a lot of talk in our community, and there has been for many, many years, about shamanism. And when we seek to legitimize ourselves through a historical argument. We reach back to shamanism and we say we're part of something which is 100,000 years old and worldwide and touched the spirit long before the shadow of the cross fell over Jerusalem, and so forth and so on. All true. And in a way that has, I think, that tendency, which is part of the broader tendency in the Western mind to valorize and grow nostalgic over the primitive, has put a certain political cast on our stance and our position. But what we are is, again contextually, is a culture of science. And I'm speaking now of our community. It's the Albert Hoffmans and the Dave Nichols and the Sasha Shulgins who have kept our canoe afloat. These are men of science. It's methods, it's vocabulary, it's culture. We have not, though we certainly honor those people and love them, as their rhetoric is not the primary rhetoric of the larger community of psychedelic users, which tends toward this, as I refer to it, this shamanistic aboriginal nostalgia. Turn left here for a moment and say, I feel more comfortable with the scientific end of things. I think the news coming out of science is the most psychedelic news there is. When I go to the internet, I go to things like Science Alert and the Hubble Picture of the Day and this sort of thing. And our community as a whole, I think, is not involved enough in incorporating the vistas. If, while we struggle to legalize psychedelics, psychedelic thinking is everywhere triumphant, because the instruments built by linear science throw open doorways on the unimaginable. And the most revered and hoary hefes of the scientific establishment have to genuflect before this stuff. I mean, what am I talking about? Well, for example, Science magazine wrote last week that the most important scientific breakthrough of 1998 was the apparent observation and agreement upon that observation by the astrophysical community of a cosmological constant. This sounds like very deep physics, but if I give it to you as a headline, what it means is the entire universe, every atom and every empty space of it, is ruled by a very weird force that has now been seriously known to science for precisely 5 months. A force which is apparently going to overcome gravity's tendency to collapse the universe and to cause it to expand in a very explosive and counterintuitive and psychedelic fashion that is the complete confoundment of the core science that Western linear thinking has built. And of course there weren't riots in the streets and the electricity didn't fail, but at the very pinnacles of the antenna of the evolving civilization, there was a shudder felt in the force, you may be sure. There are two much larger forces than our community that are in play in terms of shaping the cultural modality, and I would call them, what would I call them? Well, I would call one of them science. It's the other one that I'm having trouble with. It is everything which is not anchored in the rational. You know, the 20th century is the most spectacularly celebratory has the most spectacular celebratory affair with the irrational since the 16th century. I mean, never before have so many prophets, wizards, wise women, casters of runes, and seers of visions moved among the people, plying their wares. And part of this is brought on by the tension between the failure of the education system at the very moment of an inflationary expansion of knowledge, so that it's very hard to be au courant in all fields. And if you're not current in a field, then probably your version of that field is some kind of story, a myth. You know, I mean, if you can't keep up with quantum physics, why not fall back on archangels? You know, it requires less intellectual engagement or something like that. Discourse is fragmenting. Fields of discourse are evolving vocabularies so rapidly that the understanding of these vocabularies is not penetrating very far beyond the core group of workers. So then this is creating kind of islanded systems of self-reference, where outside those systems of self-reference, information doesn't travel. The people who are the gene splicers know very little about remote sensing, and both of those parties know very little about recent discoveries in astrophysics, for example. So there's an intellectual fragmentation. I live in Hawaii and in a forest in fairly remote conditions, and so I entertain all this in my mind all the time and try to, my faith, and I assume it's the psychedelic faith, although we've had some fairly existential characters in our ranks over the years. But the psychedelic faith, I think, is that the universe is beautiful in the Platonic sense, and therefore good and true. In other words, we're optimists. We're not flailing existentialists. We're not relativists, because we have a real standard to measure our spiritual coinage against. So we're not relativists. This is a point I'm really keen to make, because we're embedded in relativism. It's all around us. It's the air we breathe. But it is not inimical to the psychedelic community. I mean, I think the psychedelic experience is the only authentic source of reliable contact with the numinous. I mean, meditation and so on is all very fine, but it requires a leisure class involved in philanthropic support of this kind of foolishness, where the psychedelic experience is immediate and real. Somebody once told me if the Earth completely disappeared except for its nematodes, that you could still see the outlines of the continents if you were standing on the moon. I thought, now just who gathered this factoid? So then, to bring this back around a little, where is the psychedelic experience in all of this? Well, it used to be called, or at one phase it was called, consciousness expansion. And consciousness expansion in human beings is going to become an absolute necessity, because we are summoning out of the woodwork of cybernetic technology machines that are going to require super intelligent humans to direct and have discourse with them. This is happening. It is already happening. I mean, the internet is this. I mean, it doesn't tap you on the shoulder and remind you to brush your teeth, but it is, a partner in the understanding of the world that is genie-like. That's the image I have when I sit down to it. It is all John Dee would have asked of his archangelic messengers. He wanted instantaneous information on the political situation in the courts of Europe. He wanted information on the course of the Drake's expedition, then on the other side of the planet. The internet is this kind of magical, intelligent prosthesis. And as I said, there won't come a dramatic moment, I think, a la Lawnmower Man or something like that. These things are much more seeping. The only people who, in fact, can see the game move against the background of the forest pattern are psychedelic heads. You have to think about this stuff, and you have to develop vocabularies for catching it in action. This is what the game of being an intellectual is, I think. Trying to see the process of morphological unfoldment in action and guess the direction in which it's headed. Because it's inevitably headed toward greater density of information at greater speeds, higher level integrative metaphors, visually rather than textually displayed, transformation of such graphic and glyphic elements over time, it becomes more and more like the interface of a computer, more and more like some kind of machine environment. I mean, we have thought for, I assume, at least 100,000 years, maybe much longer. But the quality of thought, it was early. When it was early, it was intermittent, it was thin, it was a groping, it was an undigested intuition, a perception slipping away from the mind's eye because of media reinforcement and education and acculturation and the passage of 100,000 years. The voice of the mind, the logos, has grown stronger, but now it takes an exponential leap forward into visualization, into manifestation through this information processing prosthesis that integrates us all. Well, because this is a small group and probably self-selected for high interest in these subjects, why, as much as possible, you should direct me toward whatever your special concerns are, so that for each person, whatever their slant, there's a reasonable payback in information. And there may be areas where I'm disappointing or unhelpful, but usually then I can point you toward somebody else or some source. The first thing this afternoon, I'll bring in some books to show you 10 or 15 source books that would help you in researching any aspect of this, whether you were interested in it academically or for personal spiritual growth or whatever. It's very important to be informed. I mean, this is an area where it's very hard to bluff it because, on one level, it's a branch of medical science. I mean, what we're talking about is folk pharmacology. And you really should understand certain things about pharmacology, certain things about physiology, because your life may come to depend on it in some situation. I mean, it's not casual, You want to be able to assess risk and to make intelligent choices. So what I usually do in these kinds of situations is go around the circle and try to get a feeling for the backgrounds, the interests, and the concerns of whoever is here, and then tailor what is said afterwards the needs of the group. So why don't we just do that, and you can tell us your name, and then your particular concern or what you hope to get out of this, just something which will give me a basis then for structuring what comes afterwards. So why don't we go around in good Punpo shamanic fashion, counterclockwise. Sorry, but it was you or this poor soul. Now he can bake and consider which was worse.
Well, my name is Carolyn, and I'm interested more in the herbal lore and the herbal outlets for the purpose of, medical use. I'm interested in Chinese herbology and Western herbology. I don't know what else to say. I haven't had my coffee that much.
Well, that's pretty good.
That pretty much covers it.
How many of you are CIIS students? And now that everybody is here, how many will write a paper for this course? So 3. Okay. Yeah.
My name is Brad, and I'm interested in the psychedelic experience and how mankind has used it throughout history and what it's done for us. And I'm interested in herbs and plants in general. I don't know a lot about them, but I'm interested in studying them more and learning a lot more about them, and just present and future applications of how we can heal ourselves and help ourselves spiritually.
I'm Sibylla. Well, I think the overall interest is that I think that in nature, the main secrets of humanity are stored, whether in stones or in plants or in whales or in crystals. And I think that to access plants and to know what they carry as main information for us, that's my interest. So to rewrite the relationship not only to myself but to the plants and to nature, before we go on this information.
That's a great jacket. You don't see beetles as a fashion motif much in this culture. In Guatemala, they sell little beetles in the market on threads that you pin one end of the thread to your jacket, and then they wander all over you. They're wonderful.
They glue jewels to their backs.
Yeah, sometimes they jewel them up.
What are beetles?
These insects in the pattern of your jacket. Yes.
My name is John. I'm very interested also in psychedelic experience. In 1970, I had a psychedelic experience that pretty much changed my life and way of thinking. And I've just now, in the past couple of years, come to understand that. And I'm really interested in pursuing that mode of thinking that it sets up in your mind. And I think the psychedelic experience, well, I look at the planet and I see what's happening out there, and I think the psychedelics, plants, and those experiences can help transform a way of thinking to more cope with what's going on out there. That's pretty much where I'm coming from.
My name's Maura, and one of the reasons I'm here is the most interesting experiences I've had in my life come from psychedelics, and that was like 10 years ago when I was in college. And I haven't experimented with them since college for a variety of reasons, your analysis among them. And I've decided in the past couple of months I've just gotten interested in the subject again, and I want to find my own source of psychedelics, and if it means growing them by myself in my garage or whatever, that's the way it's going to be, or going out of the woods to find them. And I thought the seminar might point me in some right direction.
My name is Marge, and I'm interested in the experience, and I'm somewhat of a late bloomer because it's only been a couple of years ago that I first experienced some psychedelics, and I'm definitely interested in the personal transformation involved there. And I heard you talk one other time, and I'm just generally interested in anything you have to say.
Where did you hear me talk?
I think it was at the Whole Life Expo
In LA.
last year on the I Ching.
Oh, man, if you came back after that performance, you are dedicated. Remember that?
I do.
Yeah. Good. Well, welcome.
I'm Tom, and I had my first psychedelic experience in '69 when I was 9.
Oh,
You remember the Halloween candy? So that pretty much set the stage for my ongoing interest in altered states of consciousness.
My name is Janie, and I came last night kind of on a lark, really. I'd heard your name before, and I was really curious about what you had to say, but I didn't know this workshop was going to be happening. But I was really inspired by the things you were saying last night, especially, the use of psychedelics as a way to overcome the mess we've gotten ourselves in on a worldwide basis. And that's something that's very interesting to me. I used psychedelics, I guess, for the first time around '76, and I haven't used that much psychedelics in the last 8 or 10 years, but I have done a little mushroom imbibing. I'm interested as far as personal growth and understanding and breaking through some of the barriers that, I feel like I could break through as far as spiritual growth. But another main interest of mine is I would very much like to be able to share this experience with other people. I have access to a computer conferencing system in Sausalito where I'm very active, and it's really kind of a nationwide conferencing system, and a lot of people from a lot of disciplines are involved in it, and more people are getting involved in it. And one thing that I have noticed is that it's a very bright, aware group of people involved in this system, but they seem to be not very clued in to a lot of spiritual matters. A lot of them are, as far as a lot of deadheads are on it.
Is it the well?
The well, exactly. You talked to Howard last night, right?
No, I've been aware of the well.
Oh, okay, good. That's what it is.
Do you think that they're not clued in? I mean, without insulting anybody, is it because they're young?
I'm not sure. It's, like even the deadheads on the well have done a lot of psychedelics. But I think there's a certain resistance among many about accepting the unseen and the unknown. Youth may have something to do with it since they didn't go through the 60s, etc. Also, maybe the stereotypical computer mindset of being kind of linear thinkers. There are a lot of computer people on there, of course. But there are also a lot of writers and a lot of artists. So I don't know if it's just ground that hasn't been tread before and people are afraid to step out in it, or exactly what it is.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, we'll talk a fair bit about computers. Most software, I think, is written by freaks. I mean, if you hang around these scenes where it's going on, everybody has hair down to their waist, and but the relationship of psychedelics to computers and of psychedelic people to computer people and all that is very interesting. So what do you do on the well?
Well, I am just an interested participant. I just log in frequently and have online discussions with people. And I'm considering co-hosting the spirituality conference, which is just shaken loose from two very Christian-oriented people, and what they've done is split out Christianity to another conference, and now the spirituality conference is kind of wide open. So I've been kind of a hanger back. I'm not really one to get out there and start, talking a lot. So it seems like it's a grand opportunity to open up that avenue to people. But speaking of computers, I'm sure I'm talking a lot for a person who doesn't talk much, but I've been doing computer work for 20 years. That's the way I've been making a living. And what I've been trying to do now is find a way to incorporate computers with something that's more esoteric and more aesthetic. So I'm very interested in your I Ching thing. I've also worked with I Ching for like 10 or 15 years.
Oh, really?
So I'm very curious about what you're doing with that.
Well, I'll be doing a 5-day at Esalen the week after Thanksgiving that'll be entirely devoted to the computer implementation of these ideas about the I Ching. So if you can get down to that, that would be great. Yeah, I love the idea of networks, but I find it very hard to force myself to use one. It's like riding in a taxi, is how I feel about it, because I'm so aware of the money, which is a silly thing because I use electricity in my house, and I don't feel like I'm riding in a taxi. But I got onto the source, and on the source you can word search the membership for interests. So I typed out drugs, and it came back and said there were 850 people on the network who had written that drugs were an interest of theirs. So then I started checking. I said, okay, drugs without sex and rock and roll. Came back 4 people. So I didn't solve all my affinity group problems. Yeah.
My name's Toby, and I think we have a mutual friend, at least one, Terence, Nina Wise, who has been urging me to hear you at the first opportunity because she says that you have a very original perspective on things. So that was one reason I came, and then after hearing you last night, I'm particularly interested in your ideas on the social implications of these psychoactive substances, and those as an instrument for social change. So that's one interest of mine, and then a second interest is just how your notion of an archaic revival, how that ties in with one of my basic interests, which is the perennial philosophy, and how those sort of interlace or whatever. So those are a couple of central concerns of mine.
So are you a performance artist? Or
no, I have nothing to do. I enjoy the kind of work that Nina does, but I'm more of a philosopher. It's just has a lot of different interests, and that's one.
Yeah, well, I've known Nina since we were in high school together, and she, in fact, is the person who introduced me to Kat, who is the mother of my children. So Nina is webbed in there. Good.
I'm Brian. We've been recording and working with Terence for a number of years, and this is the first time I've heard him bad rap sex and rock and roll. I don't know. And musician, and generally the topic is infinitely interesting, so we're here.
I'm Boston. I like the fact that Terence tickles my linguistic fancy, and that's why I'm here.
I'm Richard, and being an electronic engineer involved in development of advanced television systems, I'm one of those linear thinker kind of technical types. So in part I'm here really for the sort of detail how-to aspect of all this, rather than the broad historic anthropological kind of message, which I, having attended your Ojai presentation, I think I have the structure of that pretty well in mind. So I'm looking for a little more detailed fill-in, which I hope this weekend will provide.
So you're looking for filled-in detail. This must be the holy grail of your life, Richard. Richard is involved in high-definition television systems and satellite transmission of high-definition video signal. So the metaphor works on all levels.
It certainly does.
Cameron, do you want to sit in there? You know, there is one empty space. I think it was saved for you.
I'm Curtis, and I recently moved to the Bay Area from Austin, Texas. So it's sort of like coming back home. This was originally from California. I was thinking, I got to come here on the spur of the moment. Came to the lecture last night and were really committed to do something else today, and got home and there was a message on the answering machine saying that had been canceled. And so he said, "Hey, we can go hear Terence." And I was thinking about, why do I want to do that? And how does why do I have that this urge to do that? And I was thinking that I really spend my life, and my professional life at least, working with people in alternative states of consciousness of one kind or another. I've spent a great deal of time in the last 5 or 6 years working with Stan Groff and a number of other people, getting different perspectives, and there are a lot of different perspectives on this kind of work. Stan has a particular kind of model that's very useful in terms of the language that you were talking about last night, of helping people to explain to people what kinds of places they go into that are accessible when they have these kinds of experiences, regardless of the vehicle that they use. Spent a good deal of time working with a woman named Jackie Small, who is one of the on the leading edge of chemical dependency work of all things, and has worked with Stan a great deal in bringing his model of the breath work out, particularly in the United States and particularly in the area of chemical dependency. So that's another point of view. I've also worked with a number of modern-day shamans here in the United States, and that's another point of view. The thing that attracts me about Terence's information, which is relatively new to me, I'd heard bits and pieces of it, but it provides me with a more, I hope can provide me with a more historical, more organic, more depth to the experience over a period of time, rather than this kind of relatively closed psychological or transpersonal psychological perspective that I've had for the last 5 or 6 years of how these materials and how these experiences work. So I'm really looking for depth from the experience, to see where it came from over a long period of time, and how that fits in with what I do.
Yeah, good. I mean, I'll say more about all that process.
My name is Terry, and I've also just recently moved to the Bay Area from Austin. I had a lot of experience with psychedelic drugs in the 60s and 70s on a recreational basis. Been reintroduced in the last year or two, and I've been doing a lot of personal growth work and spiritual work. And I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in legal psychoactive drugs and growing them and finding out more about them.
My name is Lauren. I'm a second-year student in the anthropology department here. At first I wasn't going to come to this or the lecture, and then my friend Bob here and another anthropology student said, well, if you're in anthropology, whether you're interested in psychedelics and shamanism or not, you really should have the information. And I've never taken psychedelics, unless you include marijuana as a psychedelic. I seem to manufacture my own chemicals. And I was blown away last night. It isn't often that I come across an idea or two that's completely new for me, that maybe makes sense, maybe doesn't, but it completely blows away the way I thought about things. And your whole idea about the evolution of culture somehow being tied to our relationship with psychoactive substances in nature is like, I never thought about that. and I don't know whether it's true or not, and I'll take it in and I'll study for the next year or two and see whether it's, any of it makes any sense, or whether it was, from a bad trip. I mean, I don't know.
Just remember, you heard it here first.
Footnoted over here. But I really did think that, there's some brilliant ideas there, and my interest is in the relationship between culture and psychedelics. And I had this thing, not quite a peak experience, I won't say that much, but it's a real powerful period of time last night where I all of a sudden sensed like maybe the things that we find in nature were there for a purpose. There's a relationship between human species and our evolution and what's found out here. Maybe there isn't us versus nature, us versus these psychotropic plants. It's just like like the I Ching, it's an ongoing changing rhythm, and there's this, we take something, we eat it, we do something, we put it back, our ashes go into the soil, and it was like, I don't know, it must have been a morphogenetic psychedelic field last night, but it was nice. So that's why I'm here.
Good. Well, I'm glad you came.
My name's Bob, and I'm also a student here at the school. And I'm actually pretty new to the psychedelic experience in the last 3 years. And for me, it's reached a point where I would like to perhaps, I've reached a point that most of the work I've done is by myself. But I'd like to reach a point where I can start to find maps or pathways that can help me to direct myself toward more of a spiritual understanding. And very interested in shamanism and how it ties to psychedelics. And I'm interested to find out how some of these other plants from other parts of the world can be introduced into this culture. And so that's why I'm here, to broaden my knowledge.
My name is Allison, and I'd never heard of you before I came to California, and I listened to a tape of yours, and it was really inspiring. I never realized that psychedelic experiences had such a strong effect before I listened to you speak on the entire populace of the world. I wanted to believe that, but I couldn't justify it from just me thinking that. And the lecture last night was really good. It took me a really long time to go to sleep, and usually I'm a person who hits the pillow and crashes out. I'd also like to find out more about pterodactyls, because I've had problems with other prehistoric beasts before, not particularly those, but and because I'm an artist and I want to find out more how to use psychedelic experiences to propagate art.
Propagate art. Good.
I'm also interested, too, in how we can go about inviting people that have a wall up against using psychedelics for growth, like family members. How possibly you can get them, I mean, if there's any ways of coercing them into something they might not normally feel comfortable doing. I have one member of my family that's interested in trying things, but because they're illegal, just can't justify it. And I want to know if there's any way or any place that it is legal, and that of helping other people find that way.
Yeah, well, it's a really intense issue for people, and telling someone that you think they should take a psychedelic compound for purposes of spiritual growth is usually going to set off some kind of very strong reaction.
I don't need it, is what I...
Yes, or you're saying I'm screwed up, or you're trying to poison me, or you're screwed up, or you wouldn't be saying this, these kinds of things. Recently I had to review Marshall McLuhan's letters, so I read all these letters that McLuhan wrote. And one of the things he wrote about was how nervous people got when he tried to discuss the effects of media, the unconscious effects of media. And he said that people who were raised in the tradition of phonetic alphabets were tremendously nervous about having the machinery of reality examined. And I think the drug thing is even more intensely this kind of issue, when I was in the 60s, when I went home thinking I would convert my family to taking LSD, it was very clear to me as I argued with them about it, that the reason they didn't want to take it was because they knew damn good and well that they were crazy. And they didn't want to mess with it. You know, the last thing on earth they wanted to do was probe and explore the mind. They had that all nailed down just fine, thank you. So it is, we will talk about this. Good, well, I'm glad you're here.
My name is Kim, and I think the reason that I'm here is that I'm looking for motivation in life. I think Terence last night termed it effortless, appropriate activity. And it seems that life would be better lived if there was a clear, or if not clear, at least a feeling of where we were going and what needed to be done. Mm-hmm. And there was some knowledge that we were operating with to give just more meaning in life. And so I've spent my life looking into different areas. I studied biology for a time and have gone into, not too deeply into various Sufism for a little bit, and I'm now doing, I make my living writing computer software. But I find that currently Terence seems to be the strongest magnet that I feel can lead me into, hopefully into a path towards knowledge and motivation.
A tall order for one so unmotivated. Don't make bet on it. Don't bet the baby.
It's only 40 seconds away from it.
True. And one federal felony.
I had the pleasure of hearing Terence speak a couple weeks ago in Santa Rosa, as well as listening to most of the tapes. And I was really interested in the idea of the diets of some of the shamanic cultures that apparently are very rich in different precursors of brain chemicals. And I had also heard about MAO inhibitors that were really dangerous with certain amino acids in the system. Something about fasting or that. So I'm interested in that, and I'm happy to talk about it.
And are you an MD or?
No.
No. Yeah, well, we'll talk about it, diet and MAO and all that, I'm sure.
Interest in psychedelic experience and its relationship to sort of the Western model of reality, scientific reality, and also psychotherapy. And so I guess the only thing I want to say is that I hope you include some of these incredible ideas that you apparently put out last night that I missed since I didn't hear the lecture, so that I won't feel I missed something.
We have a tape.
You can get the tape.
But I imagine some of this stuff will come around.
My name is Stephanie, and I have a great amount of respect for psychoactives and their use as in traditional kind of paths of knowledge, and have used them for a number of decades in that form. I'm also interested in them for recreation. And I'm also, one of the other main reasons I'm here is because my son has expressed interest in working at the garden with you next year, and so I kind of want to know who you are.
Okay, so you're scouting.
I'm doing my motherly duties.
What kind of a maniac is this guy?
My name is Ted, and I started out these substances in the 60s, and then after a 20-year lapse, I've taken some recently, psilocybin, and I guess my interest is twofold. One is a kind of a practical level questions like, why does physical weakness follow taking these substances, and are there any other substances that we can take before or during or after to prevent this? And ways of using the substances to gain specific kinds of knowledge, dealing with death, and then the integration of the experience into daily life, which would be your effortless, appropriate activity. And then also issues, social issues, like you last night you talked about. It takes with yoga and others, all this takes all this time and discipline to get there, whereas you can have it like this. But if you don't have the discipline, how do people take these experiences back into daily life without insanity? And then finally the issue of how do you deal with the narcissism and ego inflation that can follow the psychedelic experience in certain people, along with the complete rejection of rational thought that sometimes occurs.
Yeah, that's a real problem. I know that one from the inside. Okay, now the people who slipped in while this process was raging. Sir.
Hi, my name is John Harrison. I first heard you speak on tape 3 years ago. My mutual friend, Bob Forte, played for me. And then I had an opportunity to hear you speak at the Santa Rosa Transpersonal Conference. And what was significant for me was that you seemed to, I'm sure you've heard this many times before, but you seemed to articulate a voice that for me has been inside, that I want to express, that seems to tie together so many different aspects of consciousness, from shamanology to anthropology to pharmacology. And what's important to me is that at least for me, I want to learn how to articulate this voice so that the trivialization of psychoactives begins to cease in this society, because I believe that, as you said last night, these morphogenetic amplifiers, I love that expression, are very important in terms of our evolution. And I'm really disturbed by the environment, political environment, which says no to these tools, these potential tools for growth. And so one of the reasons I'm here, one of the main reasons, is I'd like to learn some of the ways to tie all this together so that I can be more an agent for change myself.
Good.
My name is Cameron, and I'm interested to understand myself through using different techniques in religions and moment in shamanism. And I like to learn more about plants and their use and the power to understand myself, mainly. And also I'm interested to see if there are other uses in Baniseri Kapi plants than just making the wine, and perhaps if we can combine that with effects from mushrooms or cannabis.
So going further with that plant complex.
Right.
Okay. Now, did we miss anybody? Well, I'll say just a little bit about my own interest in all this, or how I got into it. I don't know. I mean, one creates a false history when you look back into time to try and explain how you got to where you are, or at least I do. Trying now to understand how I came to be involved in the psychedelic experience, it seems to me that what it really requires is a love of the peculiar, of the weird, the bizarre, the outre, the freaky and unimaginable. And I'm not, I don't give great credence to astrology, but I am a double Scorpio, so I'm told that this kind of thing predisposes one for 12th house activity. Several times in my life I've gone through these kinds of revelations where everything seemed to change so profoundly that I could hardly recognize who I had been before. And I noticed this around the time I was 7 or 8 happening the first time. Nature and the imagination seem to be the precursors to involvement in the psychedelic experience. So I was a rock hound, a butterfly collector, a rocket builder, a connoisseur of explosives and all of this sort of thing, while my peers were off playing Little League baseball, I was back in the hills digging out trilobites and tracking down moths and stuff like that. And then science fiction was a tremendous stimulus to my imagination, because it seemed to say, anything you can imagine is fair game. Anything that you can conceive of can be treated as a reality. And but I was also I was raised in a Catholic household, so my whole thing was to build cynical resistance to the spirit. So I was an atheist, a Marxist, an existentialist, rational, material, a pain in the neck, basically. And in all of that, somehow I began reading Aldous Huxley, the social novels, Antic Hay, Chrome Yellow, these comedies of manners of British academic society. I was like 12 or something, but I always drove myself to read really beyond my level. Well, this led me to The Doors of Perception, which I had read Brave New World. Brave New World is an anti-drug dystopia, a nightmarish world of plastic, never-grow-old people who take tranquilizers every time there's a hint of any deep emotion or any kind of anxiety. They just, the motto was a gram is better than a dam. And you can just, for a quarter, anywhere, get one of these pills that just puts you right back into being happy and cooperative. And so Huxley, who was, a very concerned person, very interested in the fate of 20th century society, went from this dystopic vision of drugs to The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell, in which he describes experiments with mescaline that essentially totally turned him around and convinced him that these medieval mystics that he was so fond of, Meister Eckhart and San Juan de la Cruz and so forth, were actually describing the same reality that he was, and William Blake, that he was getting into. So I wanted to pursue this, and this was like 1962 or something, and I was about 14 years old. And then a few months later, there were stories in the newspaper that morning glories were being abused for their psychedelic effect. Well, there was a bindweed that grew locally where I lived, so I went tearing out and gathered half a peanut butter jar of this wild morning glory and took it home and ground it up and took it. And of course, nothing happened. But the hour before it before it failed to come on, I sat quietly and fearfully and examined my mind from that point of view for the first time in my life. In other words, examined my mind from the point of view of watching it to see if it was changing in some unpredictable way. And actually, though the morning glories were totally inactive, in that hour of watching, I did observe some interesting false positives that would come and go for a few minutes. And then a few months later, I got my data a little more together and learned that it was a certain species of morning glory, and that you had to buy the seeds from a seed company. And then I discovered what it was, not the full-blown psychedelic experience, but by this time I was in Southern California going to school, and a friend of mine and I would go out into the Mojave Desert and grind up low doses of these morning glory seeds, because we didn't know what a dose was, really, or what actually was supposed to happen, because if you read Huxley, it's pretty high-flown language. It's all about radiance and significance and existential validity flooding into the rose. Well, once you're looking at a rose and posing the question, is existential validity flooding into it? You know, you don't have anything to measure it about. But we would go out into the Mojave and take these morning glory seeds and observe shifts in the apparent significance of things. Everything would appear somehow more pregnant with potential meaning. And then, in fact, if you would close your eyes in that situation, there would be the beginnings of hypnagogia and, drifting lights and undulating colored patterns and grids and laceworks and all these things which are the precondition for the psychedelic experience. Well, it wasn't long after that I went to Berkeley in the fall of 1965, and LSD was available. A few months later, DMT was available, and I was just stunned and have never lost that sense of profound astonishment that such things could exist. Just that they could exist. I mean, DMT seems to argue, convincingly, I might add, that the world is made entirely of something that, for want of a better word, we would have to call magic. That, things are not what they appear, not at all what they appear, and that what we call reality is just some kind of utterly provisional construct that, if leaned upon too hard, can just fly to pieces before your startled eyes. Well, then the question is, what are the implications of this? What lies behind it? So forth and so on. So I, as most people do, or would, I think, looked to tradition for some kind of guidance about what this was, and read Jung and read Mircea Eliade, and saw, parallels, but not a clear congruency, and saw in the iconography of Tibetan Buddhism seemed to me to bear certain kinds of parallels to the hallucinations that I had by that time glimpsed in LSD states. And so studied the Tibetan language, went to Asia, learned that the iconography of Tibetan Buddhism is a rip from the pre-Buddhist shamanism of Tibet, which has been there since the Stone Age. Buddhism only entered Tibet in the 7th century with Padmasambhava, and all the iconography was taken from the autochthonous indigenous shamanism that was there. But I didn't find in these yogins and lamas and geshes what I was looking for, which was direct experience of these realities. I mean, Tibetan Mahayana seemed tremendously sophisticated in its analysis of states of mind, but operationally it was not coming anywhere close to what these psychedelics were able to deliver. Well, because I was fortunate enough to have wise and well-read friends, I knew that this tradition was alive in the Amazon. And so when I finished in Asia, and I went from Nepal to India, throughout Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, ostensibly making my living as a professional butterfly collector, but also using that as an excuse to go to these extremely rural and tribal situations and observe what was going on. And I concluded that it was far in the past or far removed, that it was something that had retreated to the status of a myth in most cultures. And then, in late 1970, I went to the Amazon, and very quickly, through using mushrooms, through using ayahuasca, learned that there it is accessed, and the traditions are alive, and the attitudes were simpatico with my own, that there were not lineages. You didn't have to pledge eternal fealty to some character, that they were exploratory in their approach. They were open-minded. Everybody admitted that nobody knew what was going on with it, that yes, they could cure, yes, they could balance their societies and act as paradigms of behavior to other members of their tribe. But what they really liked to do, these shamans, was get together and puzzle over what the hell it is and how can it be, you know? I mean, they were like scientists. They were like explorers. They didn't have a myth that encompassed it. They were technicians of myth, which they presented back to their societies. And this is something that it's very important to realize about shamanism as it is being packaged and sold in this society, that a shaman is primarily a theatrical entertainer, but they're not putting on the show for themselves. But in this society, people actually become actors on their own stage. The shamans do not believe, I maintain from spending time with them, shamans do not believe in the powers of magic words, crystals, healing darts, and so forth and so on. They manipulate these things the way a stage magician manipulates rabbits, hats, saws, and boxes with women inside them. They understand what it's for and how it works, and these things are manipulated to create an effect on other people. But the shamans understand that the real magic is the magic of sign, symbol, and language, and that by manipulating cueing, by manipulating expectation, you can lead people to a fundamental confrontation, not only with themselves, but with the other. And as I said last night in my talk, it is no easier for an Amazonian Indian to come to terms with these things than it is for a native of Manhattan. Ultimately, this coming to confront the other is coming to confront the mystery of being, not as a phrase, mystery of being. I mean, we all give lip service to that, the mystery of being. It's everywhere. It's in the trees, the stones, the elevators, the life of the city, the life of the country. Everything is radiant with the mystery of being. This is some kind of gloss. What I'm talking about is actually the mystery of being as existential fact, that there is something that haunts this world that can take apart and reduce every single one of us to a mixture of terror and ecstasy, fear and trembling. It is not an idea. That's the primary thing to bear in mind. It is an experience. And as we went around this morning, a surprising number of people spoke to it as an experience. And I think this is what makes the great distinction between the shamanic pragmatic approach and what I called last night the political ideologue approach, that we are not working here from theory. Our theories are the weakest part of what we say. What we're working from is the fact of an experience which we need to make sense of. Now, most of these other-oriented experiences, which are hard to keep track of or make sense of, cannot be commanded freely. They're more in the realm of, you're traveling in a foreign country and you contract a terrific fever and you fall into a vision and you have deep awareness and realization about the nature of life. This is not an experience that can ever be repeated. Or you're alone in a wilderness and you confront a flying object in the sky which seems to trigger strange bursts of thought in yourself. This cannot be repeated and triggered on command. So only in the context of the psychedelic experience and the willed decision to act can you enter this arena of repeatedly going to meet the experience of the other. And it is a very, very bizarre enterprise. It is not that if we do it enough times, we will understand it or become comfortable with it, because it is not in its nature to be understood, and it is not in its nature to accommodate itself to us. Rather, it's that we've discovered another dimension, almost in the same way that Europeans discovered another world only 500 years ago. In 1992, we will celebrate the 500th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. Now, notice that when Columbus set out from Spain, there was a large body of intelligent opinion which believed that he was sailing over the edge of the world, literally, that he was sailing out of mind. And instead, what lay at the end of that voyage was real estate, immense amounts of real estate. And we have come to terms with that, and in fact now inhabit what 500 years ago was not even on the maps. It was in the unconscious. Now it is the center of the global economy. In the same way that these European navigators began to have this intimation that the world was a wraparound. That's what it means to say that the world is round. It means you can get back to where you started from by going away continuously. In the same way that the European navigators discovered that the world was a wraparound, I think we are on the brink of discovering that you can start in three-dimensional space and time, move off in a linguistic vehicle, and find your way back to the place you left from. This means that what we call three-dimensional space and what we call the imagination actually have a contiguous and continuous transformation from one into the other. And this is big news. This entirely goes against our Cartesian expectation that thoughts inside, world outside, objects outside, perceptions inside. And this is actually nothing more, this inside-outside thing, than an artifact of European languages. And yet, we take it to be how God made the world, basically, because we are so embedded in our language that we cannot cognize reality without it. We cannot cognize reality without our language. But then in the psychedelic state, somehow this happens. Somehow syntax is replaced by hypersyntax. Linguistically moderated and modulated perception is replaced by perception in the raw, not coded and sculpted and sifted for culturally validated meaning, but rather just the full hit. Well, this is tremendously disorienting, but it's also tremendously liberating, because that's the full deck. That's when you have full command of the options available within the matrix. If you play the cultural game, it's like playing only with clubs or something, or playing only with the red marked cards. You have to play with a full deck, and that includes this pre-linguistic surround in which we are embedded. Now, why is it so emotionally charged for us? In other words, why can the shamans go into this dimension and heal or divine, see into the future, or in a sense see into the past by discovering who stole whose cow or who's sleeping with who, or all these things that shamans are concerned with? What is this ground of being that we discover by dissolving the cultural machinery of cognition? Well, I think what it is simply reality unpackaged for a historical epoch. In other words, reality uncompromised by the need to be culturally efficacious and useful. And this is precisely what we need to throw light on our culture crisis, because the models that we have used to sanction information that is culturally useful have given us information which is toxic. I mean, we have actually created a toxic relationship between ourselves and nature. We have pursued avenues of questioning, the feedback from which have given us an overpopulated, polluted, ideology-obsessed, unresponsive planet.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're floating in space.
That we're living in, we as a culture must conventionalize and believe that today is whatever it is, November 5th or 6th, 1988. But some of us are living in the 21st century, and some of us are living in the 18th century. And the goal, is to try and move all this forward. This is why it's funny, certain themes that have emerged in the Western mind are in fact very psychedelic, and one of them is the notion of progressivism, which is a pretty Western idea and quite psychedelic. It's the idea that things are getting better, or that things can get better. Most societies look backward toward a paradigm of a past paradise, and all effort is toward recovering this paradise. We're the only people who have this faith in progress. And it's quite strong in us, so strong that we barely question it. I remember the first time I was in Karachi, Pakistan. I was being hauled around the city in a rickshaw drawn by a guy with bare feet. I mean, it was a human-powered machine. And he spoke English, and we were scoring hash and this and that, so we got to know each other. And he said, in Pakistan, we understand what is wrong with the world. And I said, so what's wrong with the world? And he said, progress! That's what it is. We have to stop progress, which for me was quite a revelatory idea. This thing about time, though, is very interesting and operates on many different levels. Ultimately, I think what the psychedelic experience may be is a higher topological manifold of temporality. That the reason it is so puzzling and so familiar, so alien and so exalting, is that it is in fact mundane. It is in fact just us, but us sectioned through some higher spatial dimension. And if, for instance, you think about magic for a moment, let's think about the major identifiers of the magical act, such as psychic surgery, where your hand is plunged through the wall of the body cavity of a human being, and a tumorous organ is taken out, and no wound is visible. Typical and form of folk magic, much discussed. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. Or the more typical, or another form of magic, stage magic in this case. A word is written on an envelope, and the envelope is locked in a box, and the blindfolded magician is able to tell the audience what the word is in the envelope in the box. And these things are miraculous. We cannot conceive of how they could be done. But if you allow the possibility of a higher spatial dimension, then these things become trivial, because it means the body is open. There is a way to that from the point of view of this higher spatial dimension, the inside and the outside of the body are on the same side, so no problem is posed by removing this organ. Likewise, from the point of view of a higher spatial dimension, the locked box is open on one end, the end that is intersecting that dimension. So the way you read the message is you just go over and look. It's completely trivial. A way to make this cogent for people who are now thoroughly confused is to recall Edwin Abbott's fantasy Flatland, where he imagined a world of two dimensions, where a house was what in our world is what's called a blueprint. And that was all you needed, was the blueprint. And you could live in the blueprint because you walked in, and once you had closed the door, no one in Flatland could come through that blue line and get at you. But of course, to those of us in three dimensions, we just lean over and look at the blueprint and put your thumb in the inside of Flatlander's living room, and from his point of view, from out of nowhere, an enormous thumb has magically appeared in his living room. Well, this shows how perfectly mundane situations on one level appear to be absolute violations of natural law on another level. And this is happening very much in the psychedelic experience, because the mind is the cutting edge of the evolving event system. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the idea of this race that we're in between apocalypse and some kind of transformational event, and how your experience in altered states has led you to believe or
feel that there's some hope for changing that, and why?
Well, I think it's clear that we're in a race between apocalypse and breakthrough. And I suppose breakthrough is the dark horse. Everything seems to be set up to favor apocalypse. It has the inside track. Except, of course, very few people would own up to saying that they personally want to die. You know, so why is it, if none of us really want to die, why is the overwhelming global cultural image one of inevitable catastrophe? I'm very optimistic. I really think history was for a purpose. I would not have not had it. I think it was useful, and that we must have learned something very important. What we learned that was so important, I'm not sure, but probably when we need it, we'll have it. I mean, maybe we need atomic weapons because a large object will be detected hurtling toward Earth. And if nature had not split off the monkeys 100,000 years ago and evolved intercontinental missile thermonuclear weapon delivery systems that we could use to destroy that asteroid, then all life on Earth would die. So what appears to us madness, our own dedication to the release of larger and larger amounts of energy for no purpose other than to destroy ourselves, is suddenly rescued from pathology and shown to be this tremendously foresightful thing, and thank God we did this because otherwise we'd all be dead and everything else would be dead. I don't seriously believe that, but I do think that we must have learned something very, very important. Perhaps cybernetics come in here. Perhaps this exoskeleton of mnemonic material that allows us essentially to freeze and record our entire culture. Everything is going into the data banks. One way of thinking about what's going on is compression of information. And history represents a compression of information magnitudes more accelerated than the evolution of life. And then 20th century history represents an even greater information compression. Information finally compressed to such a degree that it's like the singularity inside a black hole. You know, a black hole has at its center a place where the equations don't sum. In other words, where it doesn't make any sense. And the only conclusion you can reach is that at that point of so-called infinite compression or singularity, another universe bursts into being somewhere else in a greater and vaster cosmology. And then the energy equations balance. Well, it's as though mind is undergoing this kind of gravitational collapse, and information is being compressed to such a degree that eventually it will not all fit in the present. And then the information begins to move off into the only dimensions available to it, which are the past and the future, exactly as if you fill a glass with more water than it can hold. Once it has more water in it than it can hold, the water begins to flow down the sides and out into the larger domain. And so I think that people who try to use history, which is usually male egos and male-dominated institutions, are actually tremendously frustrated. We don't see it that way because to us it looks like they win every battle, because they win every election. But because they win every election, it is their job to manage this situation. It's a case of, you want it? Here it is. And they have not a clue as to how to manage it. So their thing is all about the headaches of ownership, while our political point of view is pretty much about the headaches of disenfranchisement. But I think that there is some kind of event ahead of us in time, not far, on the order of 20 to 40 years, that is casting an enormous shadow back through the lower dimensional slice of being, which we call history, so that religions and mystical visions and the visions of revolutionary leaders are a response to flickering intimations of this transcendental object that is pulling intelligence out of the organic matrix of life on this planet in a process that is occupying 50 to 100,000 years. It's extremely unusual what's happening, and a process that creates a series of self-transforming bootstrap steps in a period of 100,000 years means it's a unique kind of phenomenon. There's never been anything like it on the planet. What it is leading toward is hard to say, but I know that its values are the values of life, connectedness, primacy of experience, and caring. And it is using the historical process to wire us all together in some way. Control mechanisms are spreading through the society at an enormous rate. You know, it's interesting, one of the horror fantasies of the 1950s, which was when, you know, this conservative, straight, crew-cut point of view was really at its height. One of the fears of the future that people would just toss off offhandedly was, well, in the future, machines will take over and run everything. And this notion of the control of the planet wrested from the sure hands of noble human beings and instead betrayed into the power of calculating automatons was a great science fiction theme of the 50s. But it's interesting how impartial computers are. They are not ideologues. They are not, they're managers. And remember, I said the struggle was between the shaman manager and the ideologue politician. And so I think the cybernetic matrix is a tremendous tool for feminizing and radicalizing and psychedelicizing the social matrix. I see computers as entirely feminine. I mean, people have a reaction to this because they think that because men spend a lot of time around them and seem obsessed with them, that somehow it isn't feminine. But men have always been obsessed with the feminine. I mean, I think it was D.H. Lawrence who said what life is really about is men keeping women from ever suspecting how truly obsessed we are by them. So I think you know, that this linking together, feminizing, cybernetic thing is part of the anticipation of this object at the end of time. What seems to be happening is we're all flowing together. I mean, we keep talking about unity, globalism, completion. Well, you better, you know, you're going to get what you ordered. And I think what it means is probably the dear individual, which, don't be fooled, is a soft description of the male ego run rampant. The democratic individual, the citizen, this notion is in fair peril to be replaced by the person, which is a much more nubbly kind of concept the person is not an interchangeable part. The citizen is. The citizen is a model of society based on the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, but the person is a harking back to a pre-print model, and this is being set loose. It's what the hippies were, essentially. What they were trying to evoke was this do-your-own-thing idea. But there's a paradox here. The do-your-own-thing idea is somehow leading to this vectoring toward a unified cultural state where everybody is involved in everybody else. It's all right that it's paradoxical, because there's no reason that it should be reasonable. Yeah.
I wonder if you could address the difference between the LSD experience and mushroom experience, if there is a difference, and also your feelings about marijuana as an older state.
Well, the LSD experience is, I speak only from my own experience, of course, but to me it seemed more psychoanalytical than psychedelic. I was in my early 20s when I encountered LSD. Maybe I had more stuff, as they say, to deal with. But it was not a reliable visionary drug for me. It caused me to have funny ideas. It seemed mostly to be a thought thing, but not a visual thing. And somehow in my education, somewhere along the way, I had picked up this bias in favor of the visual channel. I wasn't satisfied with LSD. I wanted those things that Havelock Ellis describes, where he talks about, jeweled ruins and phosphorescent maidens in diaphanous gowns howling demon songs beneath a violet moon. And that was what I wanted, not funny ideas. And what I found, and I worked pretty diligently at it with LSD, I found that my most satisfying LSD experiences were while smoking hash. And that really did do something interesting, sent it skittering off in these wonderful visionary directions. But these things do have characters. And this is something probably worth talking about in this group, that at low doses, everything seems like everything else. In other words, a little mescaline, a tiny amount of LSD, a little bit of MDMA, a tiny tad of psilocybin. All of these things simply register as wired, arousal, eager to hear what's being said and follow the thread of the argument, and just absolutely fascinated by what's going on, no matter what's going on. But as you raise the dose, the character of these things begins to appear. And, for instance, psilocybin is, to my mind, in many ways the most anomalous, because, number one, this thing about how it speaks, it does speak, and none of the others do. The others, you may occasionally, in years of fiddling, get a sentence or two, but the mushroom just is voluble. It just comes on and raves, and sometimes and people have said to me, it really does rave. It's not a calm, it's not a go with the flow rap. It's rap about planetary destiny and the next 10 million years and the last 10 million years, and it's this trumpet blast, Cecil B. DeMille, hyper, real like that. Well, then something like ayahuasca, which is this thing these shamans use in the Amazon basin that's based on DMT and monoamine oxidase inhibitors, you take that and it's about the rivers and the jungle and these people and their humility and dignity and your humility and dignity, and the earth, and plants, and life, and water, and sunlight, and it's this totally earthbound, terrestrial, life-affirming thing. And it does not speak, but it's an I, and its language is visual. And it, after an ayahuasca trip, you just feel like your eyes are literally bulging out of your head. I mean, you've spent 6 hours looking, just, not really doing anything else but looking. Well, then something like Datura has this watery, magical, forgetful, kind of witchy, occult quality. It's, shadows, and a peculiar quality of erosion of your own attention, so that, no matter who you are, you find yourself wandering through empty colonnades and under a sky pregnant with the possibility of rain. I mean, it's this strange, de Kierkegaard-esque kind of landscape. DMT has another quality. It seems to convey you into just a world of utter outrage, where all linguistic, sensory, and analytical machinery is just brought to a screeching halt. So it's important to learn what you like and to learn what you can put up with. Someone at a recent weekend who takes mushrooms quite religiously and quite regularly, and I said, does it ever get easier? And he said, no, it never gets easier. Each time what I pray as I go into it is, please let me be able to stand a little bit more. Because, finally it is the real mystery. So the only way your relationship to it can end is by you averting your gaze. Because no human being can gaze into it endlessly, because it is, it is what it says it is. It is the other. I was groping for the Hebrew, but not finding it. Yes. Yeah.
Just want to follow up on that question a little bit. Stan Grof describes LSD as a non-specific amplifier. And by that he means it amplifies what's already existing in the psyche. And he uses this metaphor that LSD serves as a kind of telescope or microscope, in that it does not itself produce the experience, but rather it enables you to have an experience that's already there in potentia, latent in your psyche. And I just wonder if you could comment on that, since you just now described the various psychoactives as having a character. So in his framework, would you disagree with it, or would you say that the various telescopes are tinted with a certain lens, or how would you sort of reconcile?
Well, at the beginning of your question, you characterized LSD it's that it is a non-specific amplifier, but of the contents of the personal unconscious and the sensorium. What people notice about LSD is either what's right or wrong with themselves, or how freaky the world is. A bug, a drop of water, it can be anything, but you discover the strangest things on LSD, and they're real things. I mean, relationships of reflections and windows, and it basically seems to be a tremendous amplifier of attention and analysis of the input of attention when directed into the outer world, and when directed into the inner world, it's an analytical tool for looking at past history of the individual, which is what I call the personal unconscious. The thing that always puzzled me about enthusiasts of LSD was that they claimed that beyond this lie what they called the white light, which they put great store by and made all kinds of Buddhist associations to it. I don't know if I've ever had the white light experience. As I go deeper into strong psychedelics, what happens is multiplicity proliferates. There is not a simplifying. There is a further and further and further complexifying. And I was talking to someone at Ojai Foundation about this, and they said, but surely beyond all this there is some kind of simplification and unity. And I said, well, that I wasn't sure, that maybe it's just, an infinite samsaric ocean in all directions, in all dimensions, forever. Ketamine comes closer to providing a no observer, nothing observed kind of state, but you can't do much with that. I mean, you can have it, but there is, of course, with the dropping of all boundaries, a feeling of release. But what I'm interested in are bringing back artifacts to share with the tribe, and I've accepted that they will come in the form of either things that can be painted or things that can be said. And since I'm better at the saying than the painting, I work like that. Stan is a good friend of mine. We've talked about this over the years. I just can't confirm his maps of the psyche. I don't see those states occurring along a continuum the way that he says they do. I think it's much more chaotic, and that if his categories work to facilitate psychotherapy, then that's good, because that's what he's interested in. In other words, I see his maps as very, very provisional and useless and useful for navigating. But I doubt that when we get the final maps, if we ever do, that they will bear terrifically much resemblance to that. And I think he would agree with that. I mean, we're not at loggerheads about this. Anybody who works with psychedelics, their ultimate position is that, hell, they don't know. And on that note, why don't we go to lunch, and we will reassemble at 2 o'clock. If you're new to the neighborhood, Haight Street is 2 blocks down Ashbury, and there's a plethora of restaurants to choose from down there. Okay, I think we're all here, or people are pulling together. So we'll talk for an hour or so, and then we'll break, and then we'll go to 4. Well, this afternoon I thought we would do some operational homework and academic referencing. One of the most important things about all of this that we've been discussing is to get the information straight, to be as well informed as possible. I mean, it's as important to be well informed in this area, if you're going to do it, as it is to be well informed about procedures in skin diving and that sort of thing, if you're going to do that. Does that make you happy?
We're okay.
Before I talk about that, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, hi. My name is Stephen, and I met you at Ralph's wedding.
Right, I remember.
Yeah, and we have a mutual friend, Dr. Marsden, who told me about some of his experiences. And I have a little bit of a background in academic herbology and pharmacognosy. I've studied pharmacy and chemistry and naturopathy. So I've had a long standing interest in pharmaceuticals and the biochemistry of the brain. But due to my paranoia of my professional license, I let it control me until about 6 months ago when I was in Sedona and started to commune with the goddess in the rocks, and she said, "Go for the mushroom."
And so what do you do for a living now?
I basically did not tell the Department of Defense that I'm employed with about these experiences. I'm a director of pharmacy services for the military at Ford and the city of Monterey. So you have welcome.
Maybe you should tell them.
I don't think
No.
You're not ready for
Maybe you could spike their punches.
Well, boring from within is always an effective strategy, maybe the only effective strategy when you're as few in numbers as we are. Well, welcome. I'm sure that whatever we said that you missed will be said again and is on tape. Okay, well, what I thought I'd do at the beginning of this afternoon today, apropos of this idea that people should inform themselves about what's going on, because though you can't find out everything, you can find out a lot more than most people know. And it's amazing to me the number of people who would pay a couple of $100 to come to a weekend with a person like myself to learn about psychedelics, when a couple of $100 would get you quite far in a bookstore, and the public library is a marvelous resource for this stuff. So I hauled some titles off my own bookshelf, and I'll go through them. This is by no means all. I just simply chose books that I thought were either important to the field or I felt would be fairly easy for someone to obtain if they wanted to look into these matters. This one, some of you may know. This is probably the easiest to obtain and the most compendious. It's Plants of the Gods by Richard Evans Schultes, who's Professor Emeritus of Botany at Harvard. And this is basically the distillation of his life's work. It's filled with pictures. It has all kinds of information arranged in this kind of table form where you can look up a plant, get a notion of what it looks like, what family it belongs to, what its chemical constituents are, and so forth. And it has a very good bibliography and a chemical appendix. So this is around and highly recommended. If you want to go slightly deeper than that book goes, this is the academic version of the same book. This is the Botany and Chemistry of Hallucinogens. This is the Bible of this field, because it lists virtually the state of the art circa 1980, and compendious bibliography, and unopened mail, and this book, though, this is an expensive academic press, but highly recommended. If you had to have just one book on hallucinogens, this would probably be the one to go for. It's also by Richard Evans Schultes and Albert Hoffman, who some of you may know as the discoverer of LSD and the man who first characterized and synthesized psilocybin. From a slightly more countercultural point of view, the revised edition of the Psychedelics Encyclopedia by Peter Stafford, who some of you may know. And again, this is an effort to be compendious. No one of these books should be taken as gospel. I mean, you want to get it from several different sources before you conclude any given fact is true. But this book is published by Tarcher in L.A. I think this is a fairly easily obtained book.
Is that new? I did talk to him at the Transpersonal Conference, and he said he's coming out with a revised edition.
That'll be, yeah, this is the second edition, and he's going to do a third edition, yeah. And he's very good about keeping up on the literature and following it through. This is an interesting book. Peter Stafford. Then, for those of you who are more inclined to pharmacology and neurophysiology and that sort of thing, this is a fairly hard book to obtain, but in a way it's never been surpassed. This book is called The Hallucinogens by Hoffer and Osmond. And there was never a revised edition after 1965. Discusses a lot about LSD and psychotherapy, and also has all kinds of strange information that was never again mentioned in the literature, that was just sort of dropped out. So you can read here about, for instance, the hallucinogen dimethyl sulfoxide, where you drink 8 fluid ounces a day for 5 successive days, and then the onset of hallucinations begin that are supposedly quite spectacular. It's just that the notion of drinking 8 fluid ounces of this bizarre chemical compound is not too appetizing. I doubt it. I think you probably have to have a scientific book searcher hunt this one down for you. Hoffer and Osmond, The Hallucinogens. And then for sort of the state-of-the-art, in a simple one in one book, is Solomon H. Snyder's book, Drugs and the Brain. And it doesn't simply address hallucinogens. It talks about all kinds of drugs, but explains the mechanism of drug activity, the notion of the lock and key activity of the drug molecule to the synaptic cleft, and it gives you a short basic course in neurology. And Saul Snyder is one of the giants of psychopharmacology, Nobel Prize winner, so forth and so on. So, Drugs and the Brain by Solomon Snyder. Let's see here. Here's another book, somewhat on the line of Snyder's book. This is one of the most recent books written on hallucinogens. It's by the editor is Barry Jacobs. Hallucinogens, Neurochemical, Behavioral, and Clinical Perspectives. And as my brother said, all of the uninteresting perspectives are covered here very thoroughly and in detail. And what these books are good for, besides whatever they say, is that they contain excellent bibliography. So tracing a particular problem, you go to these books, and then they direct you to the journal articles that give you what you want to know. Most of the literature of psychopharmacology is in journals, which you will never, as a layman, encounter unless you go to medical libraries and attempt to see these things. Things like Lloydia and, Acta Neurologica and all of this, the Journal of Psychopharmacology and this sort of thing. But you can be directed to the, some of these journals cost as much as $200 and $300 a year to subscribe to. So if you don't want to do that, the bibliography directs you to the articles you need, and you just go to the med library and Xerox them out. It's edited by Barry Jacobs. I'm trying to do this in some kind of reasonable order. Let's see. Well, then this sort of bridges the gap between pharmacology, sociology, and anthropology. This is Brian Dutoit, I guess, D-U space T-O-I-T. Drugs, Dutoit, Brian Dutoit. Drugs, Rituals, and Altered States of Consciousness. And some of the altered states of consciousness, Let me see if I can make a quick identification here. I think this is actually Banisteriopsis ruesbiana, which is a rare admixture plant, contains DMT, but has the lanceolate leaf end that distinguishes it from Banisteriopsis caapi. Probably could do 10 years for the book. The publisher on this one is a weird one. It's Balkema, Balkema of Rotterdam. So it's a Dutch publisher. The author's name is Dutoit, D-U-T-O-I-T. Yeah, this is a good one. And so then, sort of moving out of the realm of pharmacology and psychology and into the specifically anthropological stuff, this is one that a number of various contributors, alternate states of consciousness, multiple perspectives on the study of consciousness, edited by Norman Zinberg of Harvard. And this deals not only with shamanic drug usage, but heroin, the heroin subculture, and a number of different things. Urban drug cultures are discussed as well. Mostly a sociological perspective here. Zinberg. And then moving into the more specifically anthropological stuff, in what order? Let's see. Well, here's my favorite one. Before he got into drumming, Michael Harner edited this book, Hallucinogens and Shamanism, Oxford University Press, available in print, in paper. And number of writers contributed to this. There are about 3 articles on ayahuasca that you just will not find anywhere else. 4 articles. Articles on peyote. A wonderful article by Henry Munn called The Mushrooms of Language. Just a classic article on mushrooms. So this I highly recommend. No, Hallucinogens and Shamanism.
Is there a book in the Bay, a bookstore in the Bay Area that possibly might have most of these?
Well, to have most of them, that would be a breakthrough. The place I would start would be Moe's in Berkeley, and then Black Oak in Berkeley, and then Green Apple in the city, and you just basically Pellucidar in Albany. The better bookstores with large inventories of used books. Yeah, they have a drug section at Shambhala.
They didn't have very much.
Well, it's because they only have, or mostly have, in-print books. Most of these books are not in print and have to be searched for. This may be. I don't know. I haven't kept up. A sort of similar book, but by a different author, is Flesh of the Gods, The Ritual Use of Hallucinogens, by Peter First, who's an anthropologist who made his reputation among the Huichol in Mexico. And this is, again, articles by Wasson First, Doug Sharon, William M. Bowden, Fernandez, Reichel Dolmatov, the usual names in this ethnobotanical field. One of the things that's so striking about shamanism in the native context is the absence of mental illness, the absence of serious neurotic patterns of behavior. This is because this translinguistic reality is allowed to work its will through shamanism, is allowed to regulate the society. In other words, our model of how society works is we are at war with nature, and we must push it back, seize a beachhead, fortify our position, dig in, these kinds of metaphors of capture and control. While the shamanic approach is we must communicate with nature in order that nature can communicate with us, in order that we may know what should be done. And shamanism as classically practiced is hunting magic, weather magic, healing magic. In other words, ways of getting into the evolving of state-bound system patterns within nature. Weather, we would presume, can to some degree be predicted by looking at past weather states. Hunting can to some degree be predicted by looking at the migration and movement of game in past situations. So shamanism then becomes a kind of mnemonic exercise where by keeping track of what has happened, you can build up a model of what will happen. And originally this was done through great mnemonic feats of memory, like the Yugoslavian folktale singers or the Homeric epics or the people who sang the Edda. These were, works of hundreds of thousands of lines that were passed down virtually without change over millennia. But there's a strange phenomenon at least in the evolution of cultures, and perhaps more generally, which is every step into freedom contains within it the potential for greater bondage. Now, what I mean by that is, here's an example of it. Women in charge of the gathering phase in hunting gathering cultures developed language, I believe, because they had great need of the ability to make fine distinctions. In other words, here you have 50 grasses, small herbs, shrubs. They have roots, fruits, berries, seeds, inflorescences. Some of these things are poisonous. Some of these things are foods. Some grow in the spring, some in the fall, some along the river courses, some on the hilltops, so forth and so on. A great many descriptive dimensions come to bear on this. So consequently, I think women are to be held responsible for the evolution of language in order to discuss the extremely important matter of what is good to eat and what is not, and where do you find it, and how do you preserve it, and what do you combine it with, and so forth and so on. Men, on the other hand, who were in charge of the hunting because of the different body type and bladder capacity and so on, the premium there was placed on silence, stoicism, being able to stalk and for days make no noise, possibly, and to just, sort of integrate into this silent kind of thing. Well, this same kind of freedom which binds occurred in the shamanic effort to steer culture by mnemonic means, because eventually even the greatest of the shamanic memory artists were overwhelmed by the amount of data, by the size of the epics, by the sheer length of these genealogies. So then symbolic notation is brought in, and shamanism turns into scribecraft, and signifying magical forces turns into writing down their names, and there is a tremendous binding, a compression, a limitation of freedom because the strategy of freedom became too successful. So this reaching beyond ourselves is a process that is continuous. We transcend a state, we then lock ourselves into the transcendent state. It becomes defined by its own set of limitations, and we move beyond it. And this kind of bootstrapping mechanism, I think, has been at work throughout the evolution of language, throughout the evolution of shamanism. Now we have come to a similar kind of bind having to do with the bankruptcy of analytical analysis and rationalism, which has led us to a pretty complete mastery of inert matter. But when pushed into the quantum realm, suddenly contradictions begin to multiply, and impossible conclusions force themselves upon the investigator. Well, what this means is that rationalism has simply reached its limit. There is no reason to think that it doesn't have a limit. It was just the inflated fantasy of the 17th century that thought that God's mind must work like the mind of a watchmaker. But in fact, what with chaos theory and catastrophism and numerous other non-equilibrium partial differential processes in nature, we now know that nature is extremely unpredictable, highly variable, not subject to analytical understanding except in very limited domains. What this understanding that quantum physics has brought the physicists and that the psychedelic state has brought the people who pursue that, it has not fed back into the mainstream of society. We're still living in a male-dominated, object-dominated, subject-other kind of world model, a world model inherited from the 18th century, really even more than from the 19th century. Well, is it going to kill us? Is it too late? What can we do about it? This is what I talked about last night about the archaic revival as the notion of making a sharp left turn away from the momentum that the historical vehicle wants to follow, which is thanatoptic. Don't kid yourself. I mean, you cannot have three religions stacked up on top of each other, stretching back 4,000 years, pursuing this monotheistic vision, which ends in an apocalypse, without building a tremendous morphogenetic predilection for the apocalypse. And our demonic investigations into matter have led us to create the machinery to produce the apocalypse. It's interesting, somebody said of the Reagan administration this was when James Watt was running around saying we didn't have to save the trees because Jesus was coming anyway, so it didn't matter. And someone said, the jerks want to be in the Bible. And that's precisely the historical situation. The jerks want to be in the Bible. In other words, every petty potentate from Frederick Barbarossa to Ronald Reagan has secretly believed that they were living in the time of the Antichrist and would participate in the scenario of the Book of Revelations. I mean, this is psychosis if you meet it in a person. If you meet it in a culture, it's called religious piety and conviction. And it has been going on so long that it has actually created a very narrow neck in the historical process that cannot be avoided. We now have no choice in the matter of business as usual. There will not apparently be business as usual. There will either be an apocalyptic destruction of the planet, a kind of Ragnarok, a Götterdämmerung, a complete storm of fire brought on by the eruption of the psychotic mythologies that have driven the matter-centered monotheistic male ego culture, or there will be a plucking of victory from the jaws of that defeat, and not an apocalypse, but a kind of cultural millennium, a complete breaking out of the pattern into something else. And some of you may know Rian Eisler's work, The Chalice and the Blade. If you haven't read this book, I recommend it to you. For psychedelic people, for feminists, for people concerned with the state of society, this is certainly an important book. And what she's saying is partnership. It is not true that the story of the human race is the story of a pendulum swing between matriarchy and patriarchy, each with its own flaws. Rather, it is that human beings have always lived in an equilibrium-style partnership society, except during the last 8,000 years, this pattern has been disrupted by the rise of the male ego, the suppression of the logos-like connection to nature, and a certain evolutionary path taken in the epigenetic coding of information. In other words, the phonetic alphabet. The phonetic alphabet, which has no reference to the icon of the things expressed, is utterly cool, utterly unable then to give you any feeling of engagement with what is being described. This gives permission for analytical science and the detachment of rationalism and the sorts of philosophies that have created the tremendous split between head and heart that characterizes the political systems of the last several hundred years. Well, this thing which the shamans are contacting, which we can call another dimension, hyperspace, the collective unconscious, whatever it is the ground of our becoming. And the only way to sort of unhitch ourselves from the ego is to open pathways of communication to this invisible field of intentionality in which we are embedded. And this is a very difficult task because the culture in which we live denies that this thing even exists. I mean, if you start saying that you feel the heartbeat of the planet or that you are in resonance with the local ecosystem, or still worse, if you say that you hear the voices of elves and fairies, this is psychopathy automatically. You know, you have to be observed, sedated, and cured because you're participating in a model of reality that is not consensually validated. Nevertheless, I think what we're trying to do with meetings like this is empower this particular meme, empower this idea. I can't remember who developed the idea of memes, but it's basically the notion that ideas compete with each other the way animals and plants compete in an ecosystem, that ideas adapt and spread and occupy niches and defend territory and redefine environments. And so my mentioning last night of the woman who said to me, "I thought I was crazy until I heard you speak," for me that is really the nugget of this work and the most satisfying kind of comment that anybody could make, because what has happened since the 1960s is the straight people all went off together. And by this I don't refer to sexual preference. I use straight in the earlier sense. The straight people all went off and became very weird together, you know, with their golden Mercedes and their Picasso ceramics and all that. The freaks all went off and became strange alone, each apart in our own way, because community was shattered, affinity groups were suppressed, people went all kinds of directions. Now, the people who went through the 60s, approaching or in their 40s, have had 20 years to see how they like that kind of alienated aloneness. And so this morning as we went around, I heard many people saying, you know, that they had done these things in the 60s, but not for a long time, and now they were returning to it. I think this is because it finally dawns on you that, you know, this may be the only shot you've got at it. I mean, reincarnation is fine, past lives are fine, but we're all getting daily older, and we don't know where we came from, you know, what lies beyond the zygote, and we don't know where we're going, what lies beyond the pine box. Who can say? So out of the incredible mystery of whatever the universe is, a microsecond of opportunity against impossible odds has sprung into being. We are embedded in that moment of opportunity. So what are you going to do with it? Are you going to sweep up around the ashram for 30 years and then decide that that was a mistake? Or, you know, are you going to just give yourself over to the arms of Holy Mother Church for a lifetime? I mean, people do this. You cannot escape making some kind of commitment to something. Nobody gets through life without being asked to sign up, either in their own club or somebody else's. The mushroom said to me once, in the way that it does when it delivers these aphorisms, it said, you must have a plan. If you have no plan, you will become part of somebody else's plan. You either have a plan or you are part of somebody else's plan. And so I think people are waking up to the fact that we must use what works. Because you see, someone on this side of the room, when we went around, talked about yoga and how the psychedelic gives the experience on demand, but are we ready, and how do you gain skills, and this sort of thing. to my mind, the goal is not the psychedelic experience. The beginning of the path is the psychedelic experience. So if yoga promises that after 20 years it will deliver you to the beginning of the path, then, there's something seriously wrong here. The psychedelic sets you at the beginning of the path. And then people do all kinds of things with it. I mean, I am amazed. I feel there is more variation in how we deal with this than in almost any other phase of human activity, because some people seem to have almost no self-reflection. And I've noticed it also touches sexuality, because I don't know how many of you have ever encountered the Penthouse Forum, but this is where people write into Penthouse and detail these astonishing unpredictable sexual exploits, threesomes, foursomes, and 12somes that just fell upon them. And whenever I have, for some reason, some occasion to read these things, what is amazing to me is that this appears to be descriptions of the behavior of an alien species, because there is no self-reflection on what does this mean. What does this mean that I get stuck in an elevator and end up copulating with 12 stockbrokers? It's just accepted as how it is. Well, you get this same thing with psychedelics, where you say to someone and they say, "Oh yeah, in the 60s I took psychedelics. Wow, it was really strange. All these colors and voices and apparently no self-reflection, no realization that this is actually happening to you. This is happening to you. Therefore, the implications must be fairly central." And then other people immediately get it. They say, my gosh, this plant, this pill shows me that reality is at least 1,000 times larger than I thought it was, showed me that I don't know who I am, where I am, what I am, or anything else. And I don't know what it takes to instill that in people. Maybe intellectual self-reflection. One of the things that is so puzzling about shamans when you actually deal with them in the field is they are not like the other people in the tribe. The other people in the tribe are very tribal people. In other words, they have all the curious cultural limitations of people in every culture. They think you smell funny, they think you look funny, everything you do is amusing. They stand around in small groups giggling and pointing and like that. The shamans, on the other hand, it's nothing like that. They accept you totally as a person. They make no cultural judgments. You don't look funny, smell funny, so forth and so on, because they are what I call extra-environmentals. They are deconditioned from the assumptions of their own culture. So they may be the Witoto shaman, but the Witoto shaman is less Witoto than any other Witoto, because the Witoto shaman operates in the context of Witoto-ness embedded in the larger reality. And so I think what we need to do when we try to revivify shamanism in our own lives is recover the profound reality of what it's doing. Sometimes I have flashes when I'm giving these talks of how different it is to be stoned than to talk about being stoned. I mean, here we sit, in our cotton underwear, just with where we came from, our schedules in front of us, the mundaneness of it is so all-pervasive. And we could be discussing Gnosticism or a political action project, but we're discussing instead something really appalling, I think. I mean, we're calmly discussing the fact that there is another world overlapping our own, and very few people will even admit the fact. So I always think, and this is my symbol of myself, to myself, I always think of a wonderful B science fiction movie I saw when I was a kid where there's a dinosaur in the swamp, and it's set somewhere in Mexico, and the typical campesino is sent by the patron of the ranch to gather firewood in the jungle. And he, of course, encounters this extremely large rubber reptile roaring around, and then comes back to the ranch and is pointing back in the woods and is completely inarticulate, trying to say, you know, a creature from the id, a beast from another dimension is rampaging around in the forest. Well, they just dismiss him as, you know, these peasants, they believe anything, you can't trust them for a moment. This is the sort of situation we're in. The extraterrestrial invasion that so many people anticipate, or the extraterrestrial contact that so many people hope for and that sells so many cheap newspapers, is well underway. It's simply that the words we have to describe it are utterly inadequate. So words like extraterrestrial invasion, contact with an intelligent species, end of history, migration into hyperspace, these are pathetic signifiers of what is actually happening to us. What is actually happening to us is pretty darn hard to wrap your mind around. We are caught in a vortex of concrescence and compression that was set in motion at least as early as the melting of the last glaciation. We are reaping the fruits of 10,000, 50,000 years of sowing of the fields of mind, and it is being dropped into our laps for us to create human-machine interfacing, control of genetic material, redefinition of social reality, re-engineering of languages, revisioning of the planetary ecology. All these things fall upon us, and for us to be worthy of it, for us to make sense of it, for us to be anything other than victimized by the 20th century, we need, I think, to reach back into time and to anchor ourselves with the transcendent mystery, which is somehow tied up with our own being, somehow present on the planet, but mostly a large list of unanswered questions. We don't know what is going on this planet. We don't know why there is life here, whether it's an accident, somebody's plan. We don't know why intelligence is here. Again, accident, plan, if plan, whose plan, if plan, for what, if plan, where are we in the plan? I mean, we all tend, when we abandon ourselves to cultural values, to focus in so tightly that we lose the big picture. And if psychedelics are anything, they are a zoom lens back to the broadest possible point of view. Well, why don't we stop there and take just a 10-minute break or something, and then we'll come back and do dialogue on this. So why don't we use the rest of this morning to see if we're getting oriented right, and to just discuss any questions you have or anything that comes up for you out of this so far. Does anybody have anything? Yeah.
I was curious about what you were talking about with extraterrestrials and not having the appropriate language to really discuss it, and like your view of what's going on, and can you put it in words so that we can understand?
Well, it changes for me all the time. I mean, I don't have a point of view, and my primary job is not public speaking or writing, but exploring. When I first started taking mushrooms and throughout the 70s, when we wrote the Mushroom Grower's Guide, I held several opinions, but my most strongly held opinion was it actually is an extraterrestrial. Just no shit, flat out, it is an extraterrestrial. And what's surprising to me is that a single mushroom trip of a certain sort could probably put me right back there again. Getting it worked down to Gaia or the overmind of the species is a kind of process of coming down from the real assimilatable context of the experience. It's like an extraterrestrial. I would certainly say this, if extraterrestrials appeared over Washington and Moscow tomorrow, it wouldn't make this any less mysterious or puzzling. In fact, the extraterrestrials might turn out to be mundane. This is not. How it speaks, this is the most astonishing thing for me to get used to. I mean, the visual hallucinations, somehow I can work it around that these are floods of imagery set off from deep structures of the brain and dumping of memory banks, but that it can just address you in real time and say, Terence, and then proceed to blow my mind. And now several things may be happening here. The only time when we have the experience of focusing on an incoming message, decoding it in real time, and responding to it immediately is when we have a conversation with someone. So if you find yourself responding to a message in real time, your brain automatically thinks you're having a conversation, saying, if it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, it must be a duck. So here I am listening and responding to someone speaking to me in English, therefore this must be a conversation. There are physical arguments for viewing the mushroom as extraterrestrial. First of all, what is psilocybin? Psilocybin is 4-phosphoryloxy-NN-dimethyltryptamine. Of all the indole compounds in nature, only psilocybin is hydroxylated at the 4 position. Well, now, if you were to design a computer program to search Earth, to search the life forms of Earth for evidence of extraterrestrial origin, one of the things you would tell this program to do is look for unusual molecules that have no apparent cousins or relatives among other organisms. Well, here is psilocybin, phosphorylated in the 4 position. Nothing else on Earth is. a material argument for its origin outside of the terrestrial ecosystem. A slightly different argument that would see the mushroom as extraterrestrial is look at its style, for want of a better word. I mean, what is a mushroom? First of all, they reproduce by spores. Spores are the most economical biological unit imaginable. They can survive the radiation levels of interstellar space. They can survive for eons under conditions very close to those encountered in deep space. The mushroom spore falls into an ecosystem, immediately undergoes cell division. A fine thread-like network full of neurotransmitters begins to spread itself through the soil. It's very closely analogous to the neural network of a higher animal, including a human being. Now, we're accustomed to thinking that an extraterrestrial would bear the imprint of the evolutionary situation in which it came to be. In other words, if it evolved on a low-gravity planet, it will be tall and thin. If it evolved in a methane atmosphere, it will have an exotic body chemistry and so forth. But that's because we ourselves have possessed the knowledge of how DNA works for only about 40 years. It's reasonable to assume, I think, that if an intelligent species gets 1,000 years of study of DNA, that they can design themselves to be however they care to be. And in fact, if you think of the mushroom from that point of view, I think that we might choose that kind of an adaptation if we could have any form we wanted, because it's very non-invasive, very humbly insinuates itself into a situation and grows essentially on waste material in the soil. Yet when it sporulates, it can actually cross the boundary of outer space. And, great economy, great artistry, tremendous Zen-like aesthetics seem expressed in the mushroom if you view it as a designed piece of work rather than an object in the environment. And then finally, of course, the major argument for the extraterrestrial origin of the mushroom, but it's an insider argument, is the content of the experience. Number one, it says it's an extraterrestrial organism, and it has the data to back up the claim. It can show you movies of desert worlds, jungle worlds, high-pressure, high-gravity methane worlds, planets whose cores are helium-4, and worlds where you don't know whether you're inside an organism or inside some kind of piece of machinery, whether you're under the surface of a planet. I mean, literally things that our minds just stop in the presence of. So, to me, that's really the interesting thing about the mushroom, is that it can be as friendly as it needs to be, and can even reassure you with a Disney-esque burlesque of dancing flowers and pirouetting pink elephants. But once you are comfortable with it and enter the dialogue and begin to get to know it, getting to know it is an appalling experience, because you can say to it, show me a little more of who you are for yourself. And then, a veil is lifted and your jaw just drops. And then you say, show me a little more of who you, and that's enough of who you are for yourself. And you wonder, while this thing is talking to me, how engaged is the mushroom by me Is all of its attention focused upon me when I'm talking to it, the way all of my attention is focused back on it? Or is it like a multi-user computer system? Is it able to simultaneously deal with huge numbers of organisms? What is the relationship of psilocybin to the inner life of the mushroom? Is it stoned all the time? Why is it so important that these indole compounds get lodged in the nervous system of mammals? It's almost as though it's a symbiotic relationship, that the mushroom does not truly live its life unless it is taken, unless its unique molecular component can find its way into the synapses of a self-reflecting higher animal. Well, then what are we for it? And, you can ask these questions.
It seems that it's for service, like they don't impose themselves on us. We have to approach them.
Yes, they usually, one reason I think people have had trouble confirming the animate and intelligent quality of the mushroom is you must ask. You just don't take psilocybin and sit there, because it won't do it. But if you take psilocybin and call it, in some sense, whatever that means, invoke, call, try to visualize, then it will begin to come towards you and lift these veils, and this world of zany, pun-like, hyperdimensional intelligence that is revealed is as strange as an extraterrestrial would be. This is, I guess, the final content of evidence for the extraterrestrial origin, is the fact that it just seems so different from anything one could conceive of or imagine. I mean, you cannot, in one of these volleys of hallucination, convince yourself this is only me. These are my memories, or these are distorted transforms of past experience. Because I was trained as an art historian to have an eye for stylistic difference and cohesion of a set of aesthetic canons, and it just blows my mind. I mean, there is more art locked up in these things to be viewed in a single hour than the human race has produced in 10,000 years. I mean, and art of a compelling, weird, breathtaking, awesome quality that just breathes in every pore of itself. This is the other. This is not you. Don't be deceived, my little primate friend. Yeah.
It seems like our popular culture has had inklings of that, because if you look at the movies that came out, between 1952 and 1962, so many of the sci-fi movies are about spores from outer space and planets coming down, and these are from very straight people who hadn't taken, psychedelics at all. They were like tuning into what was about to come 10 or 15 years later.
Well, I think, and I'm, so far as I know, pretty alone in this opinion, that information actually, a very small percentage of information is able to tunnel backward through time. That there is a very small counterflow to the forward movement of causal efficacy. And one of the things that shamanism is about is going into that hyperdimensional place and picking up this thin signal from the future and tuning it in. This is why prophecy and seership and all of that has to do with states of ecstasy and intoxication. One way of viewing all religion and all spiritual metaphor making is as an anticipation of the future. These Western religions have this apocalyptic transformation built into them almost as a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, they believe the world is going to end because the world is going to end. And since the melting of the glaciers, people of sufficient sensitivity have heard through a vast wall of stochastic noise coming from the future the thin, reedy broadcast station of the true vision of the future. And this seems to be one of the things that you can do with these psychedelics, is tune this in. You know, it's a cliche, and I'm sure you've heard it, that artists are society's antenna for change, that artists are supposed to be somehow more sensitive than the rest of us, and they pick up the new design forms, the evolving aesthetic canons, and then translate it into society for the rest of us. Well, that gains a little more bite if you substitute shaman for artist and realize that this may not be a metaphor. It may not be simply because they pursue bohemian lifestyles and are willing to accept poverty for a life of free thinking and so forth. That isn't what's allowing an anticipation of the future. What's happening is there truly is an anticipation of the future. And visionaries like William Blake or the author of Revelations are actually people who, by virtue of some fortuitous confluence of circumstance, space, time, and genetic constitution, are able to draw these messages out. What is startling is that apparently this is fairly ordinary in psychedelic states. That in fact, one way of thinking of psychedelics is you begin to move through time when you put them into your life. I don't mean while the trip is happening. I mean ever after. I mean, if you're living with a 1960s style mind and you have a strong psychedelic experience, you will come down with a 1970s mind, or perhaps a 2040 style mind. Mind is a temporal style. It's like clothing. This is what McLuhan understood, you see, that we dress ourselves out of the closet of ideology. And someone says, well, I'm a Cartesian.